So welcome again, everyone, and to this little adventure into what I like to call the composting of our system, because I believe that we don't need to come like a really adversarial force against things, but sometimes just looking at them and really turning them might help us have some elements that are really good and that are supporting us and supporting life. So I'm absolutely delighted that Eva accepted my invitation to come here. I was telling her before, I'm trying to keep a serious face because I don't know, there's something about Eva that always makes me kind of joyful and happy, and I get quite silly. So I should warn you as well that that may happen today. So yeah, I met Eva, I think it was last year during the Conflict Transformation Summit. Hello, we have a beautiful cat too. And yeah, I was struck by, it felt like I was meeting almost like a cubist piece of art, because there were so many parts of her that I didn't know at the beginning how to put them together. And I think to me that speaks of really working on oneself and accepting parts that sometimes we reject thanks to the system, but I can see them very often shining. But I'm not going to, I don't want to introduce Eva myself. I would love for her to just say something about what you think it's important in this moment, what you feel that brought you to this day in your life and to the things that you're doing.
Thank you, Dita. And lovely to see you all. I feel like I've already met most of you in different places. So yes, it feels nice and intimate, and a meeting of friends. And yeah, feels nice. Nice to have my cat being friendly. He may turn bitey at any moment. Occasionally kind of squawked and thrown him away on Zoom in front of lots of people. We have quite a fierce relationship in different ways. So what brought me here? Well, you brought me here, Dita. You invited me. and I always like to say yes to your invitations.
Thank you.
Because I really value what you're bringing as well, and the amount of work and care that you put into convening. When I've seen you convening meetings and hosting meetings, I feel a real sense of your kind of deep care, both kind of attention to detail and to process, and just the kind of sense of heart that you come with. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And true to your invitation, I did not prepare for this at all. I've just had my lunch, but I guess, you know, you invited me here to talk a bit about this work that you and I are both engaged on, into exploring the question of how do we use politics and decision-making processes to try to transform our world and the system that most of us are laboring with and struggling with. That has lots of names, that has, you know, is capitalism, is patriarchy, is domination, is colonization, and those describe, you know, is white supremacy. Those describe different facets of something that feels much bigger and much deeper. And you know, the furthest down that route I've got so far is to look at the cultural trauma of colonization, but starting further back than I hear most people starting back. Not really that much further back, but just being aware that before those in Europe went out and stole and looted and raped their way around the rest of the world, they had had that done to them. And that those people who feel like victims of this process in other parts of the world, which they undoubtedly are, decades, centuries down the line may find that they're doing the same thing themselves. So this is a kind of a vortex of trauma that we need to stop. We need to find a way to stop. And that means all of us stopping and finding ways to address the pain, the trauma, the hurt, the violence, the huge unfairness of the situation that we've arrived into when we were born, that we didn't choose, that we have also probably been complicit with, and maybe still are complicit with, just in the way that it's difficult to live our lives. It has been made difficult to live our lives outside of this system, and yet it by not tackling it directly in whatever way feels to us, you know, brings the most of our own talents and the most juice and energy back to us, then we are continuing to collude with the system. Which doesn't mean that everybody has to spend all their time in frantic activism, but it does mean that in some way we need to nail our colours to the mast, which is probably a very colonial phrase. I don't know where that comes from, but we need to say, this is not okay. I'm not going to stand for this. And this way, if it's tiny or if it's huge, if it takes me 5 minutes or it takes me my whole working day, this is how I'm going to make a stand for something different. So for me, that kind of process of understanding, you know, that getting to where I am at the moment, actually started with, it started in different places. So there was one bit where I had been a climate activist for decades and done the frantic activism bit absolutely to the max and burnt myself out, and coming back slowly into activism and kind of cautiously, with much more time for the sense that it wasn't, there was something about the way that we had been doing, or I had been doing my activism, that wasn't working. And I began having conversations that were addressing my despair that not everybody gets this, that not everybody is decided to devote their lives to tackling climate change. And it took me quite a long time, and it was very painful for me to realize that just is the case. And if I carry on trying to force people to see it my way, I'm not going to get any further. So that was my first kind of realization, and it took me a long time to accept it, that I need to stop telling other people what they should care about and listen to, and ask them and listen to what it is that they care about, what's important to them, and what they see as the real problems in the world. Because once I've got into that conversation, then we're no longer polarizing. And my belief, my firm belief, is that most of the social problems that we have today they're all symptoms, including climate change. Climate change isn't a problem in itself. It's a symptom of a system that isn't working in multiple different directions. So having these conversations about what matters to you, what's not going right in the world as far as you can see it, what do you think should be done about it, was a beginning of really trying to get out of that activist mentality. At the same time, so another strand was this suddenly seeing that our decision-making processes, our collective decision-making processes, were very, very limited, and that there were lots of other ways. So discovering sociocracy, discovering that we can have decisions by consent that are kind of clear, that everyone knows what it is that we're talking about and why, and has already been consulted about it and had a chance to feed in, and then has a chance to object. And you know, it blew my mind. I mean, I take it for granted now, but it was absolutely revelationary for me at the time. And also from Extinction Rebellion, this kind of like real focus on citizens' assemblies and starting to learn about those, and this kind of very structured process of basically education, taking ordinary people out of their lives for a really kind of like a big think together, and giving them expert witnesses from a range of opinions so that they can hear there isn't one truth here, there's quite a few truths. So what do we think in this complex, dynamic interaction of different causes and effects and opinions? What do we think? And seeing that people were coming out of those processes going, that was amazing. I listened to people, I felt listened to, I changed my opinion. Or I didn't change my opinion, but I really understood why people on the other side felt the way they did, which I didn't before. So it's like, oh, wow, there's something really different here that is nothing to do with the politics that I'm used to, which is, you know, House of Commons, rah, 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 you know, people behaving like children, being very adversarial, being like, you know, deliberately polarized. And manipulating in the background to try to make sure that one party wins and one party loses. That's not the only way that politics happens here, but it's a big part of it, and it's the bit that we see. So that was a whole other bit, and then the third bit was about trauma. And I've been talking about trauma ever since I met my husband, and we would call it stuff. So we would get into fights with one another and then realize at some point that where one or normally both of us were coming from was actually as much to do with past history than it was with whatever's going on between us. And when we managed to, and with help of a really good counselor that we had for years, when we managed to get into those much earlier childhood experiences that were kind of getting replayed in our adult relationship, the conflict just fell away. And I had multiple experiences of going into her room just hating my husband and thinking, right, that's it, it's gone too far, cannot be doing with this any longer, and walking out feeling really in love with him and having seen his vulnerability and his you know, his pain, and understood why he was doing that thing that I really hated that he does. And likewise for him. So we called all that stuff. And it wasn't until fairly recently when I went to a workshop on trauma that I went, oh, right, that's trauma too. It's not just what happens to you in a war zone. It happens to all of us as we're growing up, and these experiences get stuck. And then we act from them in our everyday lives without realizing that that's what's happening, because it's unconscious. We go unconscious. We think that we're being perfectly reasonable and everyone else is like an idiot or scary or whatever it is that we're being activated to. So putting these three things together, of listening and understanding that a lot of the difficult stuff that we bring is actually from when we were much smaller, and can heal. And we have political systems, we have decision-making systems that could be so much better. That was the kind of the route to this idea of a project. And it came, it all came together in an article that Justin and I wrote together, called Politics, Trauma and Empathy, where we were trying to dig into some of these ideas and sort of going through the history of colonization and how that cultural trauma had happened, and and then re-perpetrates itself within us in an unconscious way. So it lives out there in the kind of geopolitical craziness that happens out in the world, but it also happens inside all of us without us even knowing. And so a new politics has to be emotionally intelligent. It has to enable us to come clean about where our motivations are coming from, and to not just come clean, but understand and be empathic to ourselves and to one another about where these, the fact that I don't like foreigners and I don't want them on our land, or, whatever a political opinion I dress it up as, it comes from I don't feel safe, or, I feel abandoned, or, all lots of very little vulnerable, sore parts. If we can't be upfront and clean about that, then our politics is always going to be coming from an unconscious place. And if it comes from an unconscious place, it's going to be playing out these patterns that we want to stop. And I feel like that the whole thing about trauma, that whole fact that it's unconscious and it's difficult to get at, is our key. It's our key to deeply, deeply changing our system. And it's a difficult key because it's vulnerable. It requires us to be vulnerable to ourselves and to one another and to a world where vulnerability and honesty about those difficult unconscious parts has been, we get absolutely no encouragement whatsoever, lots of discouragement around being vulnerable. And yet it feels like that's our path through. Because once we are in the flow of our process, once we are honest with ourselves and can be honest with one another, then it's much more difficult to take the kind of decisions that we've been taking, collectively, maybe not personally. We can't steal things from other people. We can't oppress other people. We just won't be able to do it. Or if we do, somebody else can say, you're right. That doesn't, you don't seem very happy that you want to go out and start a war with that country, or, whatever it is. It's like just developing a very different culture. How we go from here to there is a really big question, because it is so countercultural. And we're doing a bunch of different things. So currently in Scotland, we've gone through several months of doing what we called engaged listening conversations, which was trying to reach out of our own social bubble to speak to people who are different from us in one way or another, and have conversations with them about what really matters to you, what do you see that's wrong with the world, what do you think should be done about it. And we ended up having about 100 conversations. There was a group of about 20 people, and they didn't want to stop. People liked this license that you get when you're doing a project, that you can just go and approach people who you don't know and say, can I have a conversation with you? And then they were getting such a lot of richness. There were, out of 100 people, there were 2 who didn't want to talk, and they were both women, and they both said, you should talk to my husband. I don't really think about stuff like this.
That's surprising.
I imagine if they'd been pushed a little bit, or maybe if the approach had been different, then we could have got them as well. But everybody wanted, they were hungry for those kind of like really meaningful conversations. And most people were coming from a pretty caring standpoint, even if their politics ended up looking quite different. That where people start from is that they care in general. Now we're moving into doing people's assemblies, and trying to build in not only education about how different symptoms of the system link up, but also about how we attend people's assembly processes with a bit more self-reflexivity. So, you know, what happens to me when I hear something that I don't like? Do I start feeling aggressive, or do I feel frightened and pull back? And could I have a bit more choice around that? Could I make that a bit more conscious? So we're doing that at a local level in communities, and trying to develop some tools that we could just give people to help them do that process more easily and more confidently. And we're going to work from there towards a national assembly. And then at the same time, we're reaching out internationally and trying to have conversations with people from quite different cultures and different parts of the world about this idea, and trying to see that how it lands with people. And we have this event that Dieter and I are working up towards at the end of May, where we're going to have 5 days of some presentations and workshops from people who we've spoken to, and also a kind of a river in the middle of 2 hours of process and sort of group work that that we're kind of inviting people to a sort of emergent thinking and feeling process. Yeah, that heart politics. But I saw somebody asked a question.
Yeah.
None of the men, all the men were very happy to talk.
Yeah, that weird myth of women
Sorry.
talking all the time.
Yes, this is interesting, because I imagine another situation where the subject is not, let's say, so serious and political, etc. And then this will happen for sure. Men would say, "Well, but it's better you spoke with me, with my wife here."
About feelings.
It happens here, because there are subjects that are for men and subjects that are for women. So this is interesting. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. So I feel like I reached the kind of end of a cycle there.
Great.
I can always start up again if you want me to, but maybe this is a moment.
Yeah, I would love to know a bit more, if I may, about, so you said, and I find that quite important somehow, that the fact that looking at our trauma is so difficult is actually key for the transformation. And I think I may have an inkling of what you mean. I think I can sense it in my body, but I would love to know if you have some thoughts about why that difficulty is important. And given that it's difficult, what experiences do you have? I mean, I know you apply a lot of that already in your work and in meeting people beyond your personal circle.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think that there's 2 directions that occur to me to answer it. And one is, it's just to do with the unconsciousness. I think, no, let me try it the other way around. I said that quite a lot, and yet I haven't fully unpacked it, at least not recently. The other way around, it goes, the people who are at the kind of leading edge of continuing to perpetrate this system of what's essentially still colonization. You know, it's economic rather than actually people's land and bodies. But our political and economic leaders are often come from a class who've been deliberately traumatized, particularly in the UK, but I think elsewhere as well, that ruling class kids are not brought up in the same way as other kids, and they are often deliberately traumatized to be able to suppress their empathy, because if you want to hold power over other people, you can't be empathizing with them. You just can't. That's the thing you mustn't do. If you empathize with them, you won't be able to hold power over them. So the ruling class has to lack empathy, and it actually destroys a lot of people on the way. There's lots of people go through that kind of upbringing and end up, you know, just very, very sad people. And occasionally they're very sad and also very powerful. This reminds me, this really reminds me when I was thinking all this through, I had several conversations where I would end up at the end point of the conversation going, and that's why, no. And I thought, yes, that's what I wanted to say. It's all fallen into place. And then I kind of like, how did I get here? What was my chain? I could not, it took me a while to work out all the steps of logic in this argument. And I did, and I haven't had to do it for a while. I've forgotten them. Hang on, but you were saying, I'm really interested in it. You were saying that it's the unconsciousness of the trauma that is kind of key, that's at the heart of everything.
And the fact that it's difficult to look at it as well.
Yeah. Yes. So well, I mean, it's always difficult to look at the unconscious because it's unconscious. So, you know, things can pop up into your mind and you suddenly know. You can access it when it's triggered. It's actually, that's a great moment to access it. Hang on, you're having a chat. Somebody's got it.
Totally, yeah. I just thought I would type the question.
Okay. Yeah. So it's difficult to get hold of, and it's difficult to see when you're in it. When you're activated, it's often difficult to notice that you're activated. And our system is also activated, like a lot of the time. Our political, social system is also often acting out trauma rather than acting out health. And there's something about the connection between those two sets of unconsciousness that mean that the act of uncovering the unconscious, of exploring and understanding what went on, and seeing that our motivation, when it's bad, when it seems to be angry or aggressive or punitive, always comes from our own woundedness. So seeing that means that we are forgiving to ourselves, and we're forgiving to other people, and being with other people in relationship where that is a possibility, where us together looking at our shared unconscious material, it is it's like it is de-traumatizing to do that. So we can't, our system won't be able to withstand a shift where we move towards being like that with one another. We put up with the way that we're treated within capitalism, the way that we're treated within patriarchy and ableism and all those isms, because we haven't healed the trauma that's in us. And with that healing, we will no longer go along with that. We can't be bowed down. We can't be shut up. We can't be less than our full human selves. And so a movement that is saying, this is the change that we need to make. And it's not just about what's inside me, it's about what's between us. And it's not just our personal relationships, it's all of our social relationships, is a movement that, if it was successful, if it can get over the fact that few people want to do that because it feels scary and embarrassing and risky, that movement would, I think, would be unstoppable and would make the level of systemic change that we need to make. So I feel like I kind of got there.
Yes, there's something kind of, so what I'm landing, where I'm landing on right now is that, and it does feel really important to me, is that, you know, the fact that it's painful, the fact that it's not something that will happen, like, I don't know, drinking a glass of water or breathing, not yet. I mean, at some point, dealing with our own trauma may get absolutely easy, but perhaps the fact that it's a bit difficult, the fact that we need to kind of pay a price for it, makes it more easy. It makes it more part of our awareness. It's like, you know, when and I don't think this is necessarily good pedagogy, but if in my experience, if things require more of my attention, then I remember them better, and I am more part of it. And the fact that we are coming from that already very traumatized system, most of us, means that perhaps we need to go through the difficulty because that's a familiar thing as well. So it's a way that our nervous systems may have to remember better and to put also more value into what we are doing. So I think that's why I was kind of hanging on to that. You mentioning that it was difficult was also important. And there's something that I've been exploring as part of the Now What as well, where we talk about these 6 conversations as a way of building community. And there's something quite interesting there that I also want to ask about sociocracy in that respect, is that when we invite people and it's very easy to become part of something, there is less likely that people are actually going to feel part of it. And there's also less likely that they're going to make a spontaneous commitment. So what Peter Block says, who's the one who came up with these conversations, is that if you have a hurdle, if you have a difficulty, if you have a price that you pay in order to become part of, and it doesn't have to be something bad, but it's something that requires some effort, then you are more likely to really appreciate being part of the community. And again, it's not because we are paying a price. It's very often not something negative, but it requires something of our time, of our care, of our love. So it's an active process. And I think the same perhaps happens with trauma, that we need to really put it in front of us and not just let it be medicated or therapized away. I mean, therapy is really important, and medication as well, in order that we can perhaps hold it in a more direct way. But until we put it in the front, I think it's always going to be ruling us from somewhere, and that is difficult. So I don't know, maybe this is one of my blind spots speaking, because I was brought up with the idea that, you know, suffer and you will learn. No pain, no gain. So that I can hear that coming through what I say. And yet there's something about the healthy side of a hurdle and the healthy side of price, or something that we give, that kind of is there as well. Yeah.
Interesting one. Something flashed past on Facebook this morning about pleasure. And I remember Justin also teaching on hedonism. There's some thinking about, you know, that I think the left and the environmental movement have often been seen as a bit puritanical. And this person was writing about, you know, tactility and sensation and, you know, the joy of being in nature and that kind of richness that you get from the world. And that actually, you know, pure sensuality is another way through. And I think there's just different ways for different people at different times, and there's such a range needed. And one of the other things that when you were talking that I remembered was this, I saw this extraordinary program many years ago, and have never found it again, but it was a history program about the pilgrimage to Ephesus from Athens. It was an ancient world thing that used to happen, I think yearly. I think it was a solstice thing, and people would walk from Athens to Ephesus, and there was a place you would go, and there was a ritual you would do, and nobody ever told what happened. It was a mystery, and it was a secret, and you went through a process and you were changed, and nobody knows what it was. Because nobody ever talked about it or wrote about it. But there's something about that transformation that can happen, and you know, that moment, it's not, you know, it's rare, but that moment when things fall into place and you go, that's why that was happening. And all of a sudden, you know, it may be a little realization, but for you, in your person, in your body, in your history, the pieces fall into place, and there's a feeling of resolution, and now I can move on, and now I can incorporate that. Now things will be different. That, you know, there's a mystery to that, and there's a kind of a deep spirituality, I think, to this putting ourselves back together from the fragmentation that the kind of upbringing that we tend to have had has happened to us. I think which is really, really deep soul work, and it for me, it also matches the fact that our society is broken and needs that level of healing.
And how, yeah, the usual question, and I partly know the answer, I think, or I expect I know part of the answer, and it's the how. So I'm convinced that it's really down to personal agency and personal work, and I can see the enormous privilege of that. And it's a privilege that goes, for me, it goes in different directions. So there is something I've learned while reading texts about Buddhism for lay people, is that, you know, for a long time, the spiritual path was kind of the realm of the monks, the realm of the people who were actually maintained by the rest of the population. So they didn't have to make food, they didn't have to worry about housing, nothing like that. So that made kind of a separation between the spiritual inner, what I would call in this case the work on myself, and, you know, producing food, having our survival needs met. So I see that I've been incredibly privileged to have time to do work on myself. And I see that there's a lot of people in the world that have that wisdom that actually I didn't grow up with. I had to learn with time, and I'm still learning. Some people are born into a culture where they have that support, they have that village, they have those what Sophie Banks would call the return paths, where, you know, you have like grief tending, or you have ceremony, or you have, you know, a group that is supporting you. And us, as in the UK, the big corporations out of Europe, the US, and other countries, we have such an enormous influence on particularly on those parts of the world where we kind of turn the screw on the part that makes people really have to fight for their survival, because we are taking the lands away, we are taking their food away, we're poisoning, we're doing so many things. So it feels that it's a mean question, and it's not a question to you, Eva, but is there a way that you see kind of to speed up the process of the people who are holding the power at the moment really accepting the need and the beauty of having to do our inner work, so that we can really let go of screwing up the rest of the world. I don't know, it's like, how do we, there was this beautiful thing you wrote about, I don't remember exactly the exact words, but it was about mandatory therapy or something like that. It's like, what if, how do we make that happen?
Compulsory therapy.
Compulsory therapy. And I know you have experience bringing more of that inner work into assemblies and into politics.
Yeah, a little bit. And I'm trying to find ways of speaking about it that make it as unthreatening as possible. So the two ways that I found is the one that I said, where you know, it's about what happens to me when I hear something I don't like. You know, feels a pretty straightforward thing to say, and then to say, you know, we all sometimes react in ways that we wouldn't want to. And during this process, we're going to have, you know, every hour we're going to take 5 minutes. We'll ring a bell. We'll just sit quietly. You can write if you like. You can go make a cup of tea. You don't have to go inside yourself. But if you want to, that would be a time to check out how you're feeling, whether you're engaging in this in the way that you want to, or whether you'd like to make different choices. And all of that feels like, yeah, I could do that in my own community, which is probably the most difficult place to do it. And the other one would be to say, you know, as a facilitator, one of the most difficult things to deal with is when either people talk too much or when they don't talk enough. You know, it's a really straightforward process comment for a facilitator to make to a group, although I've never been in a group where someone said it. So we could check in around, so how am I? What do I think about myself? Do I tend to talk too much? Do I tend to not talk enough? And what helps me, if I'm talking too much, to be reminded in a caring way that maybe it's time to give someone else a space? And what helps me step in if I'm someone who tends to step back? So to get people to do that self-reflexivity, to look at their own habits and the possibility that they could be different. And again, it feels pretty low-key thing to say, and yet it could be, and I have yet to test it, so I don't know that it works, but I think it could be quite transformational, because it not only gets people to be self-reflexive, but it also asks for help from the rest of the group and normalizes making comments about whether other people are taking too much space or not, which is like one of the most basic forms of power, whether you tend to give yourself more preference or whether you tend to give away your power and try to give space for other people. So yeah, that feels like the kind of low-key way. But for me, working with the powerful is kind of at the bottom of my list, and I don't know that that's right. And I know that there are people for whom that they're at the top of their list. You know, there's a whole bit of Extinction Rebellion which is about working with the rich and powerful, and I'm really happy that they're doing that. But I also think that those people are so caught and so privileged by the system that it's almost impossible for them to do what's needed, certainly while they remain rich and powerful. And you know, I kind of include myself in that as well. I think one of the really shocking things about the Occupy movement was that it's, you know, it's talking about the 99% and the 1%. And then I saw the statistics saying, well, you know, if you're white and live in the US or Europe, you're part of the 1%. And I went, what? I thought that was them. But, you know, it's just the way that things work. You know, I am, although I may feel less privileged than some people in terms of the global system, I am massively privileged in so many ways that I don't even notice. And I think probably people like me are the wrong people to be saying these things and leading these movements, and yet there has to be a way to help. And at the moment, this is the way that I'm helping. And when I find a better way to help, as in be in support of the change that needs to happen, I'm really, really happily do that. But it's we've been talking a lot about privilege in relationship to this event that we're doing, and we've been trying to sort of reach out and get Indigenous people's involvement and get sort of poor Black communities involvement, and we've been pretty unsuccessful. And I suspect it's because of who we are, just anyway, and also because of the way that we're trying to reach out, and it's just so conditioned by our own privilege that we don't even see how difficult it would be to respond. And that just is as it is, and we can just sort of try to learn as much as we can. We can't, like everybody, we can't not exist, and we have just as much right to be here as anybody else on the planet. But those of us with a lot of privilege probably need to learn some difficult lessons about how to be here in a different way. And we can only ever be where we are on our journey around that.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if that answered anything like what your question was.
I think so.
A bit of a
and I trust that these things, I do trust the process as well. I'm just, when you were talking about, the inviting people who don't speak to speak, and people who speak a lot, checking that, just remembering a lot of the meetings that I attended, they were facilitated by the boss. So just that maybe the simple tweak of having a facilitator who is not the boss would make a huge difference. I never thought of that. It would be kind of slightly hilarious to imagine how that would work in that context. Yeah, I would love to hear some of the other people as well, talking about inclusivity. So maybe we just take a couple of breaths and welcome everybody to be there. And if you have comments or questions or anything that feels, yes, Eva.
Should we, because there's not very many of us, should we do a round? Because
that would be lovely.
That's not, your thoughts may not feel quite enough to put your hand out, but if you're actually put on the spot, then not very often.
I like that. And it's an invitation. It's really fine to pass if you don't want to. And again, you don't have to turn your video on if you don't want to. But I will make these little squares available to see everybody. Yeah, so then just maybe a couple of breaths.